Hello, everybody. It's Eric from Trimmed and Burning, and welcome to the Book Bible Study, where we're going through each book of the Bible from beginning to end, starting with Genesis. Our goal is to get to Revelation whenever we get to that. I don't know when it'll be, but we're in the book of Ruth tonight. We finished Judges a couple weeks ago, and Lord willing, we'll finish Ruth tonight. It's a small 4-chapter book that we learned took place in the Judges, in the times of the Judges. So up to this point, we've covered the first 5 books. I talk about that, the books of Moses. That's Genesis through Deuteronomy. And it's really vital in understanding how everything began. This whole journey here is understanding how everything began and why things are the way they are today and why Jesus Christ had to come as Messiah and be our Savior. But after the books of Moses, we got into the history books, and that's where we're at now. Again, the Bible is 66 books, so it's kind of like a library. And we went from the books of Moses. Imagine that was a category in the library. Now we're going to go to a new bookshelf, and this is the books of history. And there's 12 books on this shelf. It goes from Joshua all the way through to Esther. And I said that you can break these even into 3 groups themselves. There's Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Those 3 books are in a category of the times of the Judges, or times of before the monarchy, when Israel just had leaders that were raised up by God here and there. It started out with Moses and Joshua, and then after that, God would sporadically raise leaders up in Israel. And then after this week, we'll actually start to get to the middle section of the history books, which is about the monarchy, the beginning of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, and then how the Civil War came and tore them apart after Solomon died. We're going to learn about all that when we get there. And we're going to learn that the kingdom failed because God was no longer their king. They started to make a human their king, and things just fell apart. So that's the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Each one of those we have split up into 2 books, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles. And then after that, when we get to the end of those books there, we learn that Babylon comes and takes Judah away, the final portion of the kingdom. Assyria took the north in that little vicinity. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, the final 3 books are in their own category, because these books are about the times after Israel came out of Babylon. They were in Babylon for 70 years, and it was prophesied. You can read this in the Old Testament. There was a prophecy from Jeremiah. They'd be there for 70 years. It came to be so. And then God brought them out just as promised by King Cyrus. Another cool prophecy is in there. But that's the books of history, and if you understand that, that takes you right up to a little around 400 BC, about 400 or more years before Jesus Christ actually was born incarnate as a human baby, and lived for, as we know, 33 years until he died on the cross and rose from the dead. So that gives you a pretty good recap. When you understand these books, you're going to be able to understand the whole concept of the Bible, what God has been trying to tell us, and what's gone on, what's led up to all this. And we're learning that the family is all connected. There's one family that God has been using in the Bible here. God's using one family on earth, and it's all about bringing the Messiah. We learned it's not about the perfect family, because even the Jews, even Israel is sinful, just like the Gentile nations. The Jews and the Gentiles are all sinful. The Bible says that. All have fallen short of the glory of God with our sin. So that's what we're learning. We're just learning about this family that God preserved to be his people when he called Abraham to be the nation of Israel. He preserved this bloodline. That was the bloodline he promised the Messiah to come through. And then he has promised since that Israel will turn to Christ in the end times. And we're in the end times now, so coming up at some point, I believe during the tribulation period, Israel will have their eyes open and they'll see that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's why the enemy is always attacking the Jews. You'll always see chaos in Israel and things going on with the Jews. That's because in the spiritual war, where everything's going on, in the spiritual war, we're learning that they're a key component in God's plan. Israel is a key component for what God's doing there. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. We're at the book of Joshua. There goes. So we started the book of Joshua. We started at the book of Joshua. And that's where we learned a really important story in Joshua 2. We didn't know how important it was, but it was about Rahab. And Rahab was, sorry, I'm losing my slides here. Rahab, we're going to learn out, is a key component of Boaz. So Boaz, here, just X out of that. Yeah, right down there. That's all right. So Boaz is a key character in the book of Ruth here. We learned about Rahab, his mother. But we didn't know that connection until later on at the end of this book here. We're going to see that Salmon is tied in with Boaz and everything. So that was a big beginning of the history books. That was where they learned to go into the Canaan, the Promised Land. That's when they were entering the Promised Land. They were crossing the Jordan River. Before these history books, they were in the desert. They were wandering around because that generation had to die because of their lack of faith in God. So we learned about Rahab was in Jericho. That was the first city that was going to be, quote unquote, attacked, even though Jericho, they just walked around the walls and God gave them the victory. We learned that Jesus Christ, pre-incarnate, showed up as the angel of the Lord to let Joshua know that there's going to be some battles in the Promised Land here, but they were going to conquer the enemies. They were going to win because of what was going on in the spiritual realm. And that's how it is still with us today. The spiritual realm is primary, and what happens down here is secondary. So everything's going on in the spiritual realm, and it's affecting us. When things chaotically happen in our day, we can imagine it's chaos in the spiritual realm. That's why the key is reading the Bible and praying. Praying is the only way you can affect this spiritual realm. But in the book of Joshua, we learned that it's all a spiritual war. And we even learned that back in the books of Moses, in Exodus 17, when Moses and Aaron and Hur prayed over the battle. And that's when the hands were lifted up and they were praying, they would win. When they were dropped, they would lose, showing us when we're praying, we're fighting. When we're not praying, we're being attacked. And we're kind of like a soldier out in the battlefield with no armor on, right? But that's what happened in the book of Joshua. We see the Canaan start to be conquered by Joshua, but they didn't conquer everybody, and some of the Canaanites still lingered. And that's when we got into the book of the Judges. The book of the Judges was when we learned about the chaos in Israel, because they did not wipe out all the Gentile nations, all the Canaanites like they were supposed to, like Joshua was told. Instead, they made some of them slaves, and then eventually they became oppressed by some of them. They even started to live in idolatry and start to worship the other gods of the Gentiles. And this is exactly why God in the Bible, in the books of Moses, talked about why they're not allowed to intermarry with the Gentiles, because it was led into a lot of idolatry, and this was common back then. And even in today, you'll find out it's a similar kind of story. So they're supposed to stay, Israel's supposed to look different than the rest of the world, but we found out they started to become very sinful. We learned about the book of Judges then, how they were oppressed by the Canaanites, that they did not wipe out, did not remove from the land, how they would repent, how they'd be delivered, how there'd be peace and prosperity, and then that's when they'd slip into sin again. So we always know that when we are in peace and prosperity and things are going great in our lives, we got to be very alert, prayerful, and in our Bibles, because that seems to be in the book of Judges. It says that was the time of when sin was more likely to enter your life, when things are going great, when you're feeling comfortable and you're being prosperous. We also know it can lead to a prideful thought process. Israel would sometimes, just like nations today, think of themselves strong with an economy, a good economy financially, and then with an army, a military power. So a lot of nations back then, even today, base their strength on military power and how much money they have. And it started to get to Israel's head where they'd think they were doing everything, and we found out that God was really one fighting all these battles, just like we learned in Joshua. But we're in the book of Ruth. We're just going to jump in. We're in the book of Ruth now. We learned that this happened in the days of the judges. And we learned about how in Ruth chapter 1 there was a famine in this time period. So we know, again, the kingdom hasn't come yet. It's just what we were learning about in Judges. It even ties in again. Just like the end of Judges, we kept learning about the characters were always, people from Ephraim or somebody from Bethlehem of Judah. And this continues right on. We're going to learn about a man of Bethlehem from the tribe of Judah, and his name was Elimelech, we learned. And again, this is Christ's lineage. We're going to learn how this all ties in. That's why this book is so important. Otherwise, it kind of seems random how this almost somewhat of a love story is just kind of jammed in here in the history books. But it's very important. It's right in order. It's in the time of the Judges, and we are learning very valuable lessons here, and why it affects Christ's family, why Christ wouldn't have been able to come the way God had planned if these events wouldn't have taken place. So we learned that this man, Elimelech, he left because there was a famine. There wasn't any food in the land. He left and went to Moab. And now we learned in the book of Judges that Ehud was one of the judges that God raised up, and he had to go kill King Eglon of Moab because the Moabites were oppressing these people. So these were enemies of Israel. These were by no means friends to Israel. So we kind of see here, although it doesn't look too bad, and what we'd probably all do is the same thing. If there's no food in town, we're going to go to the town that has food. But some people argue that this is a sinful thing to do. Rather, that he should have trusted in Yahweh, his Lord, to protect him. But instead, he ended up going to a foreign land and trusting in those ways. And we end up finding out that he died then. But this was Naomi's husband. Naomi is one of the main characters of the book of Ruth here. But it starts out giving the background of what was going on. So in the days of the judges, there was a famine. and famines were thought to be judgment from God on the people wherever it was going on. So Israel had a famine probably because they were living very sinful, idolatrous lives, and God was trying to get them to repent here. We learn about Elimelech, and he had his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they, with the famine, go to Moab across the Jordan River into this Gentile nation. And it said that Elimelech, he was a sojourner, and sojourning means that you meant to return. So you were going somewhere, but you were meaning to return to wherever you came from. But we find out that Elimelech, although his intentions as a sojourner was to come back to Bethlehem, he never comes back. He actually dies in Moab, we find out. And we learn that Naomi was left with her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And then we learned that those two sons took Moabite wives. So again, this is a violation according to God's law. They were not supposed to intermarry with Gentiles, but they do it here. But we're gonna learn that God even takes the sin and the things that happen, and he makes blessings out of them. Nothing can stop God's plan. So Mahlon and Chilion, we learn, married two women named Orpah and Ruth. And you can imagine and guess that Ruth is the main character of this book, and she plays a key role in everything here. So they're the two wives that the sons take, and they lived there, it says, for about a decade, for 10 years in Moab, which is quite a bit of time. And then Mahlon and Chilion died. Now, we never learn why Elimelech died or why Mahlon and Chilion died, but we know that they died here, and it's left a tragic situation. Naomi, who just had her husband die, now had her two sons die, and she was left with her two daughters-in-law, and they were two Moabite women. So just this Jewish woman, Naomi, and her two Moabite daughters-in-law, and that was Orpah and Ruth. And back then, this was really terrible because they didn't have anybody to provide for them. If you weren't married, you were considered destitute, along with the orphans and the widows. This category of people that were poor and didn't really have a lot going for them. So it was a pretty sad state of affairs. Not only did they lose the men of their lives, but now they had this very low status in society, and life was going to be very hard. And if you don't know the ancient traditions, you might miss out on that. But that's why this was even more tragic. Not just somebody around here, like how we have people die. This was a real big social status change where they were going to lose pretty much everything they had, being wiped out almost to nothing. So, of course, we learned that Ruth heard in the fields of Moab in the meantime that the Lord had visited his people and had given food to Bethlehem and those back in Judah. And what's really interesting is Bethlehem means house of bread. That's why it was so ironic that the house of bread had no bread in it. That was a shown of a curse right there. We could see the curse right there. But then we learned that God brought it back, took the famine away, and Ruth heard about this, or Naomi heard about this, and Naomi tells the two daughters they're going to return back to Judah, but she tells them that they should go back and they should just stay here in Moab. They should go back with their families. And she cried. It was a really emotional situation because she knows that's just their best interest. Their best interest and their best chance is to go back to Moab, stay in Moab, and remarry, because that will give them status back and they'll have security and rest, as the Bible talks about. And Naomi asked Orpah and Ruth and agree to go with her. Orpah and Ruth both agree that they're going to go to Judah with Ruth, saying, no, we're going to go back. You're a mother-in-law. We're going to stick together. We're all in a terrible spot. We'll stick together. And Naomi gives them a bunch of reasons. Why would you come with me? I don't have any sons. Even if I was pregnant and could conceive a son, would you even wait? It's just best you guys go back and get husbands. And she was looking out for them. She was actually Naomi was doing this as a courtesy, like saying, this is the best you have in life. This is the best chance you have. You guys should just get remarried. I'm old and, I'm going to be a widow the rest of my life, but you guys are still young. You guys still have life. So we learned that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, in a sad state, showing that she was sad, but Orpah listened to Naomi. She's getting ready to leave. Meanwhile, we learned that Ruth clinged to Naomi. She clinged to her, meaning she stuck with her. And Naomi points out, Orpah just left. You can leave, Ruth. But Ruth says she's staying with her, and we get the famous line of the Bible, her people will be her people. Naomi's God's going to be Ruth's God. So she's committing. And this is a huge deal because, Moab had Chemosh, and there's other gods. The Philistines had Dagon. There were other gods in the pantheon that could be worshipped. But Ruth here was saying, no, I'm going to worship the God of Israel, which it was a blessing for her because that is the one true God. Yahweh is the one true God that we've been learning about here. So she makes the right choice here, which is great. And she says, I'm going to go back with you to your homeland. Even though I don't know anybody, I'm going to stick with you, Naomi. And Naomi saw she was determined and didn't try to stop her anymore. And we learned that Naomi and Ruth came back to Bethlehem, where Naomi hadn't been in 10 years. And you got to remember, Ruth's never been here because she's lived in Moab her whole life. She's a Moabite. So she's new to town. So you see Naomi come back 10 years older with this new woman with her. And the whole town, it says, stirred. And they had to start asking questions like, is that Naomi from, 10 years ago? Elimelech's wife? Is that her? Because last time they had seen any of them, it was Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, and Naomi. So now 4 of them left, and 1 came back because the other 3 died. And now there's this woman with them. And Naomi is all depressed, says not to call her Naomi, which means pleasant, but to call her Mara, which means bitter. And what she's saying is the Lord has dealt bitterly with her because took her husband, took her sons. And it's easy to look at things like this sometimes, that God is judging you or God is dealing with you bitterly. But God had a plan. Sometimes bad things we learn just can happen, no matter if you're doing the right thing or not. But Naomi, as you can imagine, like any of us would be very depressed to have lost her whole family and probably thought God was judging her, that Yahweh was dealing harshly with her. So she says, call me Mara. But the best part is nobody calls her Mara. God doesn't ever let her get called Mara. And it's a reminder to us that God chooses our identity. We don't identify with the bitterness, but we identify with the pleasantness that God gives us. And then we learned that it was the beginning of the barley harvest. So it's confirming that what she heard was true. There's going to be a harvest of barley in Bethlehem. God had blessed the land. And that was Ruth chapter 1. That's how the book started out, where we learned about Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. Then we went to Ruth chapter 2, and this is where we ended last week. This is where Ruth met Boaz. She meets Boaz in this scene. So Naomi starts out mentioning that she had a relative in Elimelech's family, and his name was Boaz. So it kind of starts getting brought up here. And then Ruth says to Naomi, you know what, I'm going to go glean fields and find favor with anybody I can in these fields. And that as part of the law of gleaning we learned about. The law of gleaning was a welfare system for people like Ruth and Naomi, widows, orphans, and other destitute people. And the thing here was that the reapers of the people that owned the fields could go through the field one time. But after this, whatever was left had to be, it was a welfare system. The widows and the orphans and anybody that needed food could go out there, who didn't have anybody to provide, could go out there and glean the fields. This is the law given by God that they were following here. And it says that Ruth went out there and gleaned in the fields after the reapers and just happened to come to the field belonging to Boaz. But we know there's no such thing as a coincidence. It's showing how this looks like an accident, like it wasn't organized, but it was ordained by God. So they couldn't have organized this. Ruth and Boaz didn't even know each other. But we see God's hand over this whole thing where Ruth just happens to be in the fields of Boaz. We learned that Boaz again came from Bethlehem, and he asked the young man in charge of the reapers who this young woman was. He must have noticed her, whether she was beautiful or new in the area, we don't know, but he seemed to notice her. And the man replied that this was the Moabite woman who returned with Naomi that they saw come back from Moab when Naomi was spotted in Bethlehem. So it tells this whole story, and she has been known around Bethlehem. This is a popular thing, kind of like rumors that spread around town. There was this story about Naomi and this woman Ruth, and how Ruth was so great because she was from Moab, but she agreed to come and start worshiping Yahweh and follow with the people of Israel. So then, the man said that she even asked to glean the fields, which she had the right to glean them, but it's showing that she was honorable and submissive. We're going to see that a lot about Ruth here. And that she continued from early morning up until the point they were talking, with only a short rest in between. So Ruth was out there working the fields very hard because she was supporting her and Naomi. So we see a good work ethic here on Ruth's behalf. So Boaz says to Ruth, don't worry about going to another field. You can stay in my fields. Keep close to the young women that work in my fields. You can stay right here. And then he tells the men not to touch her, because out there it could have been dangerous for women, especially widows. So he makes sure that she's protected. Boaz is looking out for him. Boaz, you can kind of see, has something going on with Ruth here, and he wants to make sure she's protected and taken care of. And when she's thirsty, she should even go and drink the water, he says, that was drawn by the men. So he's giving her access to water, and he's really providing for Ruth, which is awesome. So she falls on her face in submission and showing honor, saying, she can't believe she found favor in his eyes. She's a foreigner from Moab. She's surprised that he even noticed her. And Boaz says he did this because of what she did for Naomi. He heard about how honorable she was, and he wants to help her and return the favor. And then at mealtime, it says that Boaz invited her to come up and eat bread and drink wine until she was full. and even had leftovers. So he's really giving Ruth the treatment here, which is really special because, again, she's a Moabite woman, but she's being honored for her dedication to the Lord, to Yahweh, and supporting Naomi. And it says that when she rose to glean, Boaz told his men to even leave bundles for her to glean behind. He's kind of rigging the deck for her. Although they were only supposed to get what they couldn't get, what that was supposed to be left behind, he's saying drop some good, sized grain for her so her and Naomi can be taken care of. And then we learned again that Ruth gleaned until the evening. She was gleaning all the way up until the end, so she's a hard worker, again, we're learning. And she ended up taking all of it into the city in Bethlehem after she got it. Naomi saw all the grain, and Ruth gave her the extra leftovers. So you can imagine the scene. Ruth left to glean the fields in the morning. They had nothing. She comes home with all this harvest, right, of grain and some extra food, a little, doggy dish or doggy plate or whatever for her, a doggy bag for her to eat. So some leftovers. So you can see they're being blessed. The blessings are coming in. Ruth tells Naomi that the man that she met was Boaz, and this is the man, that Naomi had talked about before. And Naomi points out this is a close relative of theirs, and he's one of their redeemers, which was a kinsman redeemer, or in Hebrew was a goel, G-O-E-L, a goel, and that was a redeemer. And this is everything in here is to point to Christ. So even the law of redemption here was to point to Jesus Christ. He is our redeemer. But we learn that Boaz will fulfill this law that God wrote about in the books of Moses when he gave the law that said that somebody next in line of a man who died could redeem the land, could buy the land back, because all the land really belonged to God. And even after 50 years of the year of Jubilee, all the land was supposed to revert back to the tribes and the clans that owned them. So Boaz was able, as a redeemer, if he's the redeemer, he's able to go out and buy the land before the 50 years were up and get the land back for the family. So Ruth tells her that Boaz, liked me and said I should stay with his young men. And Naomi says, this is great that you're able to be in his field. Otherwise, you'd be assaulted. So not only are you being blessed, you're being protected. So it's just, you can see God's providence over Ruth and Naomi here with all their turmoil going on in their lives. They're still being taken care of. So Ruth, it says, kept close to the young women of Boaz. She gleaned until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest, and Ruth lived with her mother-in-law. So we learned that this is a process. This wasn't just like a day or two. She stayed probably for weeks here, gleaning barley and wheat and reaping a lot of benefits here. So this is a common thing where they were able to eat. Boaz really took care of them, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So even Ruth and Boaz probably got to know each other quite a bit, even just seeing each other in the fields. Although they wouldn't have been dating or anything like that, so to speak, they would have seen each other and probably been comfortable with each other. I'm sure greeted each other, and he would have seen her working hard. So it's been a couple weeks now, probably, if not longer, and she's been gleaning the fields. And that's where we left off with Ruth chapter 2. Is there any questions for anybody in the room or online? If you're watching online, you can type in any questions or comments right now or at any time, and Phil will relay those questions and comments, and you can interact with us just like everybody else in the room here. Does anybody have any questions or comments based on the first 2 chapters of Ruth? Yeah. Oh.
So I picked up on when Naomi was talking to Ruth. Ruth explained that Boaz said that she should stay among the young men, but then Naomi said, "No, you should stay among the young women." I see like there's a little difference there. Can you play into that?
Right. So basically, this whole situation, what Naomi's looking out for with Ruth here when she's talking about the abuse and things that can happen is she's making sure that she's safe there. So staying among the women was probably safer, obviously, than staying among the young men. What's really interesting, though, too, is that there's young men in the field here, and Ruth herself, obviously, is probably young. And it would have been, in any other situation, you probably would have seen Ruth and one of these other young men maybe in the fields form a relationship. And we're going to learn that's going to be a key component later. Boaz was probably an older, wealthier man, owner of the fields here. But Ruth would have not really hung out with Boaz so much as the young women and the young men in the field. But it was definitely safer to stay with the young women. And then the young men had to be told by Boaz. So that's a great point. Boaz had to tell them, make sure she's okay, keep your hands off her. So he was making sure to protect her, because back then it would have been dangerous for an unmarried woman with no protector, no male protector, no provider there to be used and abused. So Naomi was very concerned about that, but was very happy that Boaz was providing for her. So great, that's a great question. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, we're going to jump right into the new chapters, the last two chapters of Ruth. We're in Ruth chapter 3 now, and this is where Ruth and Boaz are at the threshing floor. Now, first you have to know what a threshing floor is. A threshing floor was during harvest time. There was wheat, and they'd actually have to go out there, and they would usually go out to the edge of town or outside of town there, and it was where there would be a lot more wind. You needed wind for this process. But what you would do is they would take with kind of these pitchforks, they would take the wheat and they'd kind of toss it up in the air. So the wheat and the good grains would fall down with their weight. And then the chaff, the bad stuff you didn't want, would be blown away by the wind. So they'd kind of pick the barley or the wheat up, they'd throw it in the air, and one pile would drop, the good stuff would drop, and the bad stuff would be taken away. The chaff they didn't want would be taken away. And then after this threshing process, they would take the good grain, obviously, bag it up and go sell it in the market. And with the chaff, the stuff that blew down, they would have that in another pile and they would set it on fire. They'd burn it. And that was to get rid of vermin, to get rid of like mice or any kind of vermin that would come in and eat things. So they'd burn all the extra chaff. And you can probably start to see the spiritual application here. Although this is literally happening, there is a spiritual application here. The Bible is always talking about, especially in the New Testament, the harvest, how Christ is going to come and reap the harvest. But there's chaff too, right? There's chaff. There's the wheat and the tares. There's the good ones and the bad ones, right? The wheat and the weeds, basically. And we're seeing that even in the threshing process that happens, where they throw the wheat up, the good stuff falls, the bad stuff goes down. And the good stuff is kept, right? That's the good wheat, the good barley. And the stuff that is tossed is burnt, right? So you see that kind of tying in. Those who accept Christ are a part of the harvest. Those who don't will be thrown into the lake of fire, right? Just like the chaff here. So the scripture, when they're talking about that kind of a concept in the harvest, is talking about this. It would have been very familiar back then. And that's what's going on here in the book of Ruth. So Naomi tells Ruth that she wants to seek rest for her. And basically what she's saying here is, I want to find you a husband so you're provided for and taken care of. And she points out that Boaz, again, points out that he is a relative that could do this. Like, Ruth, you could marry him. Boaz could redeem us and take care of all of this. So Naomi says Boaz is winnowing, which winnowing is what I was just talking about. When you pick up the wheat and you toss it, that's winnowing. He had a winnowing fork. But he was winnowing barley at night down at the threshing floor, Naomi says, and says, Ruth, you should wash up and anoint yourself, basically put perfumes on, make yourself, basically take a shower and put perfume on, for today's words. Make herself all nice for Boaz, and that she should not make herself known to him until he is done eating and drinking. So basically Naomi's saying, Ruth, I want you to look nice, smell good, and don't bother him until he's done eating or drinking, but you're going to go in, and Boaz is right down there at the threshing floor, and he's going to be working there all night. Now you have to understand that this whole process, the threshing process, it was a long process and it took a while. That's why they were there at night. And the reason they'd stay there doing this at night is because the wind would sometimes pick up, but also because there were, obviously just like there are today, there are thieves. And thieves could come and break in and steal your wheat and your grain, all the hard work that you did. So what you'd do is you'd go down there and you'd work throughout the night, and then you'd sleep by your wheat and your grain so no thieves could steal it. So Naomi knows we're getting near to the end of the harvest and says, Boaz is going to be down there. Ruth, you should go down there and check this out, and just don't make yourself known until after he's done eating and drinking. So Naomi says, watch where he lies down, keep an eye on him after he's done eating and drinking. Watch where he goes to lie down to sleep, because he's going to sleep by the barley and the wheat. He's going to sleep by it so it's not stolen. And you should uncover his feet and lie down next to him. This is a whole thing that's going to show authority, submission and authority by Boaz. Ruth, what if she lays by his feet, is to show a submissive stance, that she wants to take his authority, and basically saying that she would want him to take her as his wife, basically. So Naomi says that she should go down, uncover his feet, and lay down there, and that Boaz, she says, just rely on whatever Boaz says. He'll tell you what to do, she says. So just go with it, which is kind of a risk. Boaz could have said anything, but she's probably feeling pretty confident the way Boaz has been treating her, that there's a good chance this will work out. But says basically, just trust the Lord. Boaz will tell you once all this is just what you got to do. So Ruth agrees to do what Naomi says, and Ruth goes down to the threshing floor, and it says did what her mother-in-law had commanded her to do. Boaz ate and drank. It said, and his heart was merry, so he ate and drank, and then he went to lie down at the heap of grain, a big pile of grain that he had winnowed, I'm sure, him and his workers. And Ruth came softly and uncovered his feet and laid down just like she was told. So she followed the script perfectly. She waited until he was done eating and drinking. She did it quietly, and she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid down. And it said it was around midnight, so the middle of the night, middle of the dark night, and Boaz was startled. So imagine he's sleeping by, the grain, the heaps of grain here, and all of a sudden somebody startles him awake. And he's probably thinking at first that there's a robber, some thief coming in to steal his grain or his wheat. And then I'm sure he was happy to find out that it was only Ruth. It was just this woman, and it's probably dark, so he probably couldn't even get a good look at her first. But he sees it's Ruth, and he asks, who is this? Because he can't tell. He says, I'm Ruth, your servant. And he says, that he mentions here how the Lord's going to spread the wings over her servant, just like because he's a redeemer. It's this whole wing scenario here with spreading the wings over. It's language that God has used about covering Israel. It's a protection here. The spreading the wings over the servant as a redeemer is showing protection here. And that's what the conversation is being had. But Ruth reveals herself to Boaz right here. Boaz asks that the Lord blesses her. He knows it's Ruth, that she did not go after young men, he says. Like, this is great. You did not go after young men. You could have, but you've come to me. You didn't go after rich or poor young men in general, but you've come to an older man like me. So he's so impressed, and he wants God to bless her for this. Boaz says that he's going to do all she asks because all the townsmen know she's a worthy woman, he says. And he says it's true that he is a redeemer. So he confirms what was heard. And now you got to remember, Ruth was not from Israel, so she probably didn't know the law very well. So remember, she's going with the script from Naomi and probably was like, hey, Naomi says you're a redeemer, whatever that means, and that you might be a relative. I don't know how this works. So you can imagine it'd be like somebody like us was sent out with some kind of culture that we don't know, and we're just like, hey, I was told this would happen. And Boaz confirms, like, yep, nope, you're exactly right. I'm a redeemer, just like Naomi said, and I'll take you as a wife. Yep, we're going to go ahead and do exactly what you're talking about. So he confirms all this. But there's only one problem, he says. He says, there's one problem. There's a redeemer that's closer than me. Basically saying, according to this law of redemption, there's actually somebody ahead of me that's closer to Elimelech. So Boaz says, remain the night. And if the other man redeems you in the morning, that's great. In the morning, we'll just go. And if he redeems you, that's great. But if he's not willing to redeem you, I will, Boaz says. He says, no matter what, you're going to get a husband. You're going to get a redeemer. We're going to take care of this, the law of redemption and the Levirate marriage. We're going to take care of this. If he doesn't, I will. So Boaz tells her to lay down in the morning. And it says that she arose while it was still dark. So probably couldn't really see things very well yet. It was still before the sun was really coming up. And Boaz says, let it not be known that you came to the threshing floor. Now, nothing bad happened here, but it was just probably a bad look to find out that she was here asking him when there's another redeemer. It was kind of out of line, and it could have even looked bad. There's this woman here, and nothing had probably happened. We see good character from Ruth and Boaz, but he says, hey, don't let anybody know you were here. Just kind of get out of here, and we'll take care of this whole situation. So before she leaves, Boaz tells her, he says, before you go, hold out your garment, stretch it out, almost like stretching out your shirt, and he says 6 measures of barley. So he doesn't send her away empty-handed. He says, here's a gift. I don't have a box of chocolates for you, but I have some barley. Here, take this back to Naomi. So she goes back. This is kind of her parting gift here. She goes home, and Naomi greets her. So she's going to see this blessing again. She comes back. Ruth shows her all the barley that Boaz gave her, and that Boaz told her she shouldn't go back empty-handed. So Naomi says that Ruth should wait to hear how it all turns out, and says that Boaz will settle the matter today. Says, this is exciting. We got to see how this all turns out. This is all great. We got a lot of barley. And he's saying that if the redeemer, the other guy, this redeemer ahead of him doesn't take you, he will. So she knows this is good news and says Boaz is going to settle this. And that's chapter 3 right there. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts right there on Ruth chapter 3? Yeah, Howard.
Ruth made herself look nice to go to Boaz. It's
Yeah.
kind of like how in Revelations, the church in the New Jerusalem are made ready for the wedding supper of the Lamb.
Amen. That's beautiful.
And how Ruth uncovers his feet and laid at his feet is how, I guess, the 24 elders cast themselves at Jesus at the feet of the Lamb.
Amen. So you can see that's great. Howard's picking up on, again, how you can see a lot of this kind of stuff tying in to Revelation. He's saying even about how Ruth lays down at the feet. The elders come down, at Jesus' feet in Revelation. How Ruth, anointed herself to look. She dressed up, looked beautiful, anointed herself with oils, probably great fragrances. And that's, it talks about a lot in the Bible about preparing ourselves, being ready, being a pure and spotless bride, preparing ourselves, being ready for the wedding feast. So Howard, you find a great point there. Now this again is just showing us more and more signs It's all pointing to Christ, all pointing to us, or our plan with Christ. Not pointing to us directly, pointing to Christ, but applying to us, right? Applying to us how we should be like Ruth. And Christ is like Boaz, that we should remain spotless. We should make sure that we're, being honorable, submissive to Christ, knowing that he will be just like Boaz, even better than Boaz. He'll take care of us. He'll love us and provide for us, just like Boaz does with Ruth here. So it's a beautiful story. You can see the story of Ruth and Boaz is like us and Christ. So it's just awesome to see here. Yeah, we got something over here, Phil.
So I like to point that I like the Jesus, when he was accused, he was able to go through a bunch of people unnoticed, but then I think about Boaz and the high stature that he was and the people that he must have been around him for her to get up and just go out unnoticed. That's that's God ordained.
Right. So, so she had to go. So Boaz was probably very wealthy man, probably one of the well-known, quote-unquote, business owners. You can think it was like a wealthy business owner probably. And Phil's saying here, it's there's probably a lot of people around him, probably had a bunch of workers there. It must have been really hard for Ruth to sneak out. I'm sure it was. That's probably why there's that key component. If you look in there, she got up while it was still dark, while it was still hard to see. So almost think about kind of even going out in the middle of the night, right before the sun starts to rise, maybe 3 in the morning, 3:30 in the morning, nobody's going to see you. Sneaks out quietly while it's still dark, because you're right. It probably wasn't just like, and then she walked out the door and there was nobody there. No, there's probably people all over, maybe sleeping with or around Boaz. We don't know the situation, but there's probably a lot of people. He was wealthy, so I'm sure he had a big staff of people there. So yeah, that's a little detail there, but Ruth probably, even to get out of there, was probably a whole situation. Yeah, we have another one.
So then we have one online from
Online, all
Christopher Evans. He says, okay, so why did Ruth need to be redeemed? Why is redemption relevant with a widow who stayed true to her husband?
Oh, this is fantastic. Saying, why did Ruth need to be redeemed? Because we're learning about the redemption. What's the significance of redemption here? What's the whole purpose? That's a great question. So this all comes down to the land in Bethlehem that Naomi left. So what we're going to learn out is actually that although it looks like he's redeeming Ruth, he's actually redeeming Naomi and Elimelech's bloodline. So Boaz is basically going to step in as a proxy for Elimelech. Boaz is acting as Elimelech, and Ruth is acting as Naomi. It's a strange situation here that Ruth is kind of stepping in. Although she's not replacing Naomi, Ruth is going to step in on behalf of the family, and Boaz is going to be, part of Elimelech's family, and keep the family going. The redemption comes to the land. So they had sold this land 10 years before when they moved to Moab. When they moved to Moab, they sold the land, and it had been 10 years gone. So now there's somebody else that has this land. So that's the problem. They've moved back to Bethlehem, and there's nowhere to go. So imagine where you lived right now. You moved away, you sold your house and your yard, and 10 years you want to come back to town, but there's nowhere for you to live. You don't have any money, and somebody else is living in your house and has, a whole family, with your yard and everything. The only way you'd want to get that land back, you need somewhere to live. So that was going on here. That's where the law comes from. So Ruth is acting on behalf of Naomi because she's young enough to bear children, and Boaz is acting on behalf of Elimelech to carry out that line. And because of this, Boaz is going to be able to buy back the land. The redemption is about buying the land back. So when Boaz redeems her, when he marries her, once they're married, on behalf of the family of Elimelech, he'll be able to go buy Elimelech's land back that was in Bethlehem that was sold 10 years ago. And then Naomi and Ruth and Boaz will all have a place to stay. So that's a great question. And the even bigger way the law of redemption plays into all this is really, this is just pointing at Jesus Christ. So we learn in Revelation 5, Revelation chapter 5, to understand it fully, you got to understand the law of redemption, which is, I believe, in the book of Deuteronomy. I think it might be Deuteronomy 25. You can fact check me. And then Revelation 5 is the key component to understand this, where the law of redemption was all about the land, and Christ is our true redeemer we're learning about. The earth right now is not ours. The earth is the God of this world is Satan, and the dark spirits are kind of ruling things here. And in Revelation 5, we learn that John cries because nobody can open up the deed. And remember, deed, like a deed of land. That's exactly what this is. Nobody can open up the scroll. Nobody's worthy. Nobody can redeem the land because they were not in line. And that's why he's crying. And then all of a sudden the Lamb comes. That's representative of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the one who's able to redeem the land, to restore the earth back. And it's exactly what he's going to do. When he comes back in his second coming, he's going to restore the earth. There will be no more deserts. There will be life, flourishing life and water in those places. And he's going to buy back the earth. So that's what this is really pointing to here, that when Jesus Christ comes back, restores earth, redeems the land, he will be our Goel, our Redeemer. That's why we call Jesus Christ our Redeemer. He redeems our souls and saves us, but he redeems the earth, that we can live with him on earth forever. So that was a great question, Chris. Thanks for joining us online. But that's where it really plays into that Boaz is redeeming Ruth, all for this land in Bethlehem that they sold 10 years ago. So they can basically have a house and a yard back. So great question. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments on the chapter there? All right, we're going to go ahead into the last chapter. We're going to finish up the book of Ruth here. And this is where you guessed it, Boaz redeems Ruth. It's the great climax here. It's awesome. So it says that Boaz, the scene starts with Boaz. He goes out to the city gate. Now, the city gate is kind of like city council / a courthouse, all right? It was kind of like a double-purpose thing. You went down to kind of talk to the leaders of the area, the elders of the city, and they kind of made judgments based on the law of Israel that God had given them, and it kind of kept society going. So it was a city council / courtroom, you can think about it. And the Redeemer that Boaz spoke of shows up. So Boaz talked about this man who was next in line. Boaz is second in line. So there's a guy ahead of him that he has to give a chance to redeem Ruth, which is ultimately redeeming Naomi, we're learning. So Boaz asks this man to sit down. And it says that he also has the 10 elders of the city to sit down for the talk. So it's kind of going to have a legal discussion here. The 10 men of the city sit down. Boaz sits down, and this Redeemer that's ahead of Boaz. And Boaz tells the Redeemer about Naomi. Says, Naomi, she left 10 years ago. She went to Moab, and now she's back. And I love what it says. It says she is selling the land. It's really interesting. She's selling the land, it says. So basically, he needs to buy this back on behalf of Naomi because he says it belongs to our relative Elimelech. It's a really cool concept for this man to be next in line. He must be Boaz's relative. So they're relatives in some way. We don't know how. But Boaz and this guy he's talking to are relatives. And it says this land belongs to our relative Elimelech, who died out in Moab, and his poor widow's here. And I'm just trying to get the land back. I want to settle this. So Boaz says, I want to make you aware, and you can, in the presence of the men here, you can redeem the land if you want. So he says, here's 10 men sitting here. If you want, I just want to make you aware, you're next in line. You have an opportunity to redeem this land. But if not, Boaz says, I will. He confirms, I will. He says, I'm next in line if you don't do it. But the man says, it's kind of like an Orpah situation. The man says, no, I'll redeem it. I'll redeem it. So this man, unnamed man, agrees to redeem the land for Ruth and Naomi originally. So Boaz, but then this gets interesting. Boaz says, okay, by the way, there's kind of fine print here. With the land comes a wife. And the guy goes, oh man, forget about it. This will ruin my inheritance, or she'll take all my money and spend it on shopping and all this stuff. I don't want to deal with it, right? He's like, no, thanks. I thought this was only about the land. I didn't know it involved a wife. But Boaz is like, no, you got to continue the inheritance of the dead. So a wife is necessary to carry on the bloodline. He's like, the Levirate marriage, he kind of points it out, the Levirate marriage, she's privy to another man carrying on the line for Elimelech. But the Redeemer says, no, I can no longer redeem the land. The deal's off. I didn't know it included all that fine print. I didn't sign anywhere. It would impair my inheritance. So he says, Boaz, you can have the right of redemption. And then we learned that it was custom in the former times in Israel, even before the book was written. It's learned it was a custom back then, concerning the law of redemption. And it's actually written about in the Bible earlier on, where what would happen is if the person that was the Redeemer, the Goel, like this man was, if he was unable to redeem the land, he was to take off his sandal, remove his sandal, and give it to the other man, almost saying, I'm passing this on to you. And then the second thing that was supposed to happen that we don't read about here is the woman, which would have been Ruth or Naomi here, would have spit in his face. She's supposed to spit in his face to show that he lacked the honor, that he was dishonorable for not following through with the commitment by law he was supposed to keep up with. But because there was no dishonor here, because the woman was not in the presence there, we don't see that aspect. But we see the sandal lifted up here, basically saying, Boaz, you're up, I pass, it's on to you. So he's showing everybody right there, all those 10 men. Remember, it's kind of a little courtroom council kind of thing. He's showing the men, I'm picking up my sandal, I'm passing this on to Boaz. I'm going to give him the right to redeem her. So Boaz takes the sandal and tells all the elders there that they're there as witnesses that he has bought Naomi's land. So he says, right now you can see there's a deal. I've bought her land and all that belonged, and I love he lists all three men. All that belonged to Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. So he's saying, I'm buying back all the land that was to these men that was sold before, this whole family here. what was owned by them, I am now buying back. And Ruth is the widow of Mahlon, we learn here. We didn't learn that up until this end point. We didn't know if she was married to Mahlon or Chilion until we get to the final chapter here. Ruth's husband was Mahlon. We learned that it was the widow of Mahlon is who Boaz is going to marry, which is Ruth. And he says, I have now purchased her to be my wife. So he buys the land and he purchases Ruth. I love this language, by the way. Didn't say he got down on one knee and proposed to her. It says that he purchased her. He bought her with a price, right? And I'm going to have some videos coming out on the ancient Hebrew wedding that'll help you understand this. But this was how weddings worked. This is how marriages worked back then. They were arranged marriages, and there was a purchase price, the mohar it was called. And this is why Jesus Christ had to purchase us with his blood. The blood was the price. The life was the price he paid for his bride, which is the church here. So we're seeing that concept here that he purchased his wife. This is how it worked back then. He would purchase her, and there would be the whole process where Boaz would have had to go back to his, father's house if he was around. He was still living there, which Boaz is older, probably didn't have to here. But he'd go back and set up a room. That's why Jesus prepares, a place for us. It's all wedding discussions, all wedding talk here. But he purchased a wife, just like Jesus Christ purchased us, the church, with his blood here. So Boaz says he's doing all this so the name of the family is not cut off. And that is not cut off from his brothers or the gate of his native place, so that his name will always be known. Elimelech's family line will carry on. And then the elders say, we are witness to this, kind of put the stamp of approval on it, and then the saying here says, may the Lord make her like Rachel and Leah. So that's an interesting quote right there. May the Lord make her like Rachel and Leah. Does anybody have any idea what it might mean why they would say, may the Lord make her like Rachel and Leah? Any guesses or questions? This is a tough one maybe, but I just want to see if anybody had any thoughts. Yeah, you want to give it a shot, Phil?
These were the wives of Israel for the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah, okay, so that plays key. That's a key component. So these were the women, and now there was Bilhah and Zilpah. There was the concubines as well. But these were the two women, the two wives of Jacob. And Jacob, we know, is Israel. His name was changed to Israel. So what we're seeing here when it says, may the Lord make you like Rachel and Leah, those are the women that were responsible for the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation of Israel. So what they're saying here, these women are the ones together build up the house of Israel, it says. May you be like Rachel and Leah who built up the house of Israel. What they're saying is, may the Lord bless you with the messianic bloodline, this special bloodline. So we're seeing hints here that this marriage, this situation here with Ruth is going to be key to the bloodline of the Messiah. So that's what that's saying here. May you be like Rachel and Leah and continue on the bloodline, the house of Israel. Then there's another line here, which is prophetic, we'll learn. It says, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Because of the offspring the Lord will give Boaz by Ruth. So he's saying, may your house be like Perez, because you're going to have, basically saying there's going to be a special child, there's going to be a baby born. They didn't even get married here, and they're saying there's going to be an offspring born. May your house be like the house of Perez. Now, if you guys don't remember, Genesis 38, I believe it was, it's called the Judah interlude. It's that what looks like a random chapter in between the story of Joseph. When you get to Joseph, you'll start to learn Joseph's story, and then all of a sudden, Genesis 38 will take a wide right, kind of veer off here, and start talking about Judah and his sons Er and Onan. And then it comes back into the story of Joseph. But that chapter is so important here. What happens to that story, to recap, you guys who might not have been with us in the Genesis Bible study, or forget, because there's so many stories that go on here. He had sons Er and Onan, and what had happened was Judah, this is the real Judah, the tribe of Judah, what it's named after, Judah himself, Israel's son. His sons were wicked. They had wives, but the son was wicked and died, and this is where the Levirate marriage came in. So his other son, I believe it was Onan, was supposed to step in for Er, because he had died, so he's supposed to continue on the bloodline for his brother. And instead, he went through the act, it says, which you can guess what that was. He went through the act of conceiving a child, but instead it says spilled his seed on the land, almost like a slap in the face. Like he went through the process, but then he spilled his seed on the ground, and he was not going to have any children. He was not going to continue on the process. It was sinful, and he ended up dying too. So Judah had this problem where Er and Onan, his sons died, and Tamar was the woman there that was left with no husband. And he had another son that was a lot younger and that was promised to Tamar. And this whole weird situation happened where Tamar ended up acting and hiding like a prostitute. I don't know if you remember the story. She disguised herself like a prostitute. Judah, which is her father-in-law, actually ended up sleeping with her. And that's how she got pregnant with twins. There's actually, Perez had a twin, and there were twins in the stomach, just like Jacob, how Jacob was a twin with Esau. There's twins here, and Perez was one. And Perez was a key twin here because Perez is the bloodline of Jesus Christ. That's why Perez's name is listed here, and that's why it's important. But the issue here with Perez was that he was illegitimate because he had been, Judah and Tamar were not supposed to have a child here. But nonetheless, God carries the bloodline. He continues it on here. But there's a curse of 10 generations you'll learn about because of this. He was not able to enter the house of the Lord for 10 generations from that family bloodline because of what Judah and Tamar had done. And what's interesting in that story, by the way, is Judah, I believe, leaves his signet ring. So basically like his identity with Tamar, he forgot it there. And he at first chastises Tamar for being pregnant, saying, you don't even have a husband. I can't believe you as a prostitute would do this. And then Tamar kind of holds out his ring and says, you're the one that got me pregnant. And then Judah, he says, I'm terrible. I'm worse than you, Tamar. I am worse than you. Judah kind of gets caught in his sin here. But we learned that was an illegitimate child having Perez there. And Perez was one of the two twins. Perez is the one, and I even believe there's a red thread there in this story here to show the scarlet thread of Christ's family, where Perez comes out as the one in Christ's family. That he's important in this bloodline. And that's why Perez is listed there. It's almost like a prophecy. So we learn then, of course, that Boaz and Ruth get married, and go figure, Ruth conceives and bears a son. Well, that's a spoiler. We already knew that was going to happen, but this is right where it happens. She conceives and bears a son, and is one of the most important parts of the story. The women say to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who brought you a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel." So they're saying, glory to the Lord, glory to God who has redeemed you, right? And think about this. This book about redemption and God, providing a redeemer was before Jesus Christ ever came. That's why you can see it was always the plan for Jesus to be our Savior, for Jesus to be our Redeemer. That's what the whole law of redemption pointed to, why we needed Christ. Now, Christ fulfilled all of these things. Christ is our Goel. He is our Redeemer. But blessed is the Lord who brought you a Redeemer. May his name be renowned in all of Israel. So it still stands true even for us, our Redeemer in Jesus Christ. So they say he shall be a restorer of life and nourisher of her old age. And because, they say she had a daughter-in-law who loves her and who has more than 7 sons to her, has given birth to this boy. So they're saying here, that Ruth, because she's so honorable to you, Naomi, she is more valuable than 7 sons to you. And then we get this really interesting situation where Naomi nurses the baby. So it's really bizarre where the grandmother of the child basically is nursing the child. But this is just to show that it's carrying on that bloodline, that Ruth has stepped in for Naomi on behalf of Naomi because she was a Moabite. She's stepping in on behalf of Naomi because Naomi is too old to carry a child. So Ruth bore the child, and Naomi does this as a sign to show that she is the mother. It's carrying on this bloodline of Elimelech and Naomi, that Boaz and Ruth are carrying it out in this Levirate marriage kind of a situation here. And then it says that the women, I love this, the women of the neighborhood are the one that named the baby. She didn't even name her baby. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine having to name your kid based on what the women in the neighborhood wanted to name it? That's a really interesting concept. Who knows what they'd end up being named. But they named the baby Obed. And Obed, we know, if you know in Matthew or in Jesus Christ's genealogy, he's right in there. Obed is the father, we learn, of Jesse. And Jesse is the father of David. King David. David that becomes king. David that killed Goliath. That was a shepherd, becomes king of Israel, the second king. This is his family. This is why this story is so important here. And it's so interesting because earlier, remember in the beginning of the Bible study, I was talking about Rahab. Rahab was in Jericho. She was a Gentile, just like Ruth was. You're going to see on either side of Boaz. Boaz is kind of in this like Gentile woman sandwich, by the way. So Rahab was a Gentile woman who turned from the gods of Jericho, the gods of Canaan, and said, I'll hide your spies, Israel. I'll hide them on my roof. Just, save me and my family. And Rahab and her family were saved. That story in chapter 2 of Joshua is so important because if Rahab was not saved, Boaz would not have been born. Because Rahab goes on to marry Salmon, and Salmon is in the Messianic bloodline. And Salmon and Rahab had a son named Boaz, right? So if she would have never been saved out of Jericho, if Rahab would never been pulled out of Jericho and her family would have been killed, Boaz would have never came, which David would never came, which Jesus would have never came. That's why this is the perfect story. We're seeing God's hand over all this. And Rahab was a Gentile woman, a woman that was from a Gentile nation that followed other gods. Is Boaz's mom. And then his wife is Ruth, a Gentile woman from Moab. How interesting is it? So he's in like a Gentile sandwich here. But it's showing us, even this is the Old Testament again. This is before Jesus Christ has died on the cross and redeemed. And you learn later that Peter was confused too, but the Gentiles were in the plan to be saved. Remember we learned that in the New Testament? We can see that it was always the plan in the Old Testament here. Rahab was a Gentile, just like you or I. If you're not a Jew, we are Gentiles, saved just like Rahab was able to be saved. Even in the Old Testament, we showed that God would save you if you called him your one and true king and your one true God. So if you called on the name of the Lord, you called on Yahweh to be saved, you were saved just like Rahab was. And just like Ruth, who is from Moab, she turned from the Gentile gods, the worldly ways, and she chose Yahweh, and she was saved. So even in the Old Testament, it was always the plan for both Jews and Gentiles. It does not matter, Jew or Gentile, that if you repent from your sins and you turn to God, you'll be saved. So it's such a cool thing here. And then Ruth 4, the whole book ends here with the generations. And this is very important based on what I talked about with that Perez prophecy. So it says, here are the generations of Perez. So I'm going to list them as Perez is number 1. Because remember, there's a 10-generational curse. And you're going to realize they list 10 generations right here. And without knowing that Perez was cursed because of the Judah and Tamar situation, the illegitimate situation, you wouldn't understand why 10 tribes or 10 generations are listed here, but it's very important. So it says it went from Perez to Hezron, to Ram, to Aminadab, to Nashon, to Salmon, who was Rahab's husband, to Boaz, to Obed, who was just born here. He fathered Jesse, and then King David is the 10th generation. So right on time, this is before the book of Samuel, before any of this stuff happens. This is the time of the judges, and you can see it's prophetic that everything was right on time. Perez was cursed for 10 generations, and at the 10th generation, the next person eligible to go back into the house of Israel was David, and he became the king. And this is why God gives him so much favor. Judah is finally back in. So Judah was kind of cursed and cut off for 10 generations. So the promise of the scepter not departing from Judah is back when David comes in as the 10th generation. That's why this is such a powerful ending to Ruth. When you start to understand this, you see why David got special treatment by God. He was a man after God's own heart. Why he says, I will make sure you remain on the throne forever. It's because it was cursed before David. All those generations in between missed it. It went from Judah, skipped all the way down, and then 10 generations after Perez got to King David. And God says, this time I will permanently establish this kingdom here through you. And we, of course, know that he's talking about Jesus Christ, who is also a part of this genealogy. Although God is the father, his bloodline, human bloodline, the other half is Jewish, and it comes right through this bloodline. And this is why this whole book matters, because the Messiah was going to come from this bloodline. And we're just learning how God has blessed them and has kept his promise, even when it looked impossible. Even when those generations, because they were legitimate, couldn't come into the house of God, he brought out David and continued on the bloodline. Even later on, with the curse of Jeconiah, it happens again, where they can't, have a king. There can't be a king birthed from the seed of Jeconiah. It looks cursed, and that's why God the Father had to be the father of Jesus Christ. It was a twist on the end. So all this stuff with genealogies, don't ever skip over it. It's all important. It'll all point to Jesus Christ and show why all these stories are important. This is not just some random love story. This is to show us how God's divine providence is over everything. Even things that look terrible for Naomi, when her husband and her sons died, look what happened. The messianic bloodline was brought through. Now, could you imagine if the story started out, says, this is the story of the messianic bloodline, and Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion all die, and they're the ones that were supposed to bring the bloodline. It would look like a sad story. It probably looked like it was all over, but in the end, God was able to redeem what looked like it was dead. Remember, from death to life. This book starts out with death and goes all the way up to life. And again, the story of Christ, right? We were once dead, and he brings us to life. And that is the book of Ruth, encapsulated, the 4 chapters of Ruth. And that's why that book's in there. And that completes the time of the judges and the time before the kingdom. After this book, we'll go into 1 Samuel and start to learn about how they went from the time of the judges with Samuel into the kingdom. But does anybody have any thoughts or questions or comments, either in the room here or online, about what we talked about here in the book of Ruth? All right. Well, thanks again. It's a nice short book. You guys can always go back, recap, read it again now that you have a different idea of it, and also prepare for the book of 1 Samuel we're coming up to. So go ahead, read ahead. We're trying to do 2 chapters a week, so you can read Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. Next week is a holiday. Thanksgiving is coming up, so we know there's a lot of you guys will be busy Wednesday night. So next week we'll take the week off. We'll try to get a video up for you in the meantime so you can watch it, maybe not a Bible study. And then the following week we'll be back in the book of 1 Samuel. So now we're kind of turning the corner, getting into the kingdom and how the kingdom of Israel and Judah all began. And it's continually telling the seamless story how God had this great plan here. But thanks again for watching, for studying the book of Ruth with us. We hope you'll continue on. If this is your first Bible study with us, go ahead and go back. You can watch all of them from week number 1 all the way up to now and catch up. Be prepared for next Bible study in 2 weeks. Remember, next Wednesday will be the holiday. After that, we'll be back and read 1 Samuel. We'll learn about that. Make sure to like this. Go ahead and share this so other people can see this. Subscribe and follow so you can watch more of our videos and see our Bible studies. But until next time, keep your lamps trimmed and burning.